Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I like to begin my presentation by sharing with you that this particular iconic building itself was a terrorist target. ISIS, or the Islamic State, a terrorist called Gigi Rahmat Deva, he planned to fire a rocket to the Marina Bay Sands in 2016. Singapore authorities, working with their Indonesian partners, disrupted that operation by arresting Gigi Rahmat Deva and his network in Batam. So today, the fight against terrorism remains the highest national security priority, because with the proliferation of ideologies globally, what we have seen is that there are cells that are created, cells, networks, groups, and personalities that want to do attacks. And I want to draw your attention to the latest terrorist attack in this region. Last Friday, just 4 days ago, a mosque was attacked. It was a mosque in a school, and the 17-year-old Indonesian student, he staged an attack and 54 students and teachers were injured. My colleague at D88, the Detachment 88, Indonesia's elite counterterrorism unit, led the investigation. And based on the investigation, they found that although he was an Indonesian Muslim, he was largely influenced by Brenton Tarrant, who was a white supremacist that staged the attack in Christchurch, New Zealand. So you can see the comparison of the two weapons. The debriefing of the 17-year-old, we were able to ascertain two things. He was very much animated. He was very much influenced by the leadership of Brenton Tarrant, not so much by his ideology, because Brenton Tarrant marked in his weapon various names and slogans of previous attackers. It is that influence that drove the 17-year-old individual. That is why I commend the Australian initiative to restrict the use of social media until you're 14 years old. So one of the greatest challenges that even Singapore faces is the self-radicalization of youth, because these ideologies are globally active and they continue to drive the current threat landscape. So unless we contain the spread of these ideologies, we are going to fail. I decided to be very frank today, and I want to share with you that it is Facebook or Meta, it is TikTok, it is Twitter, it is the social media platforms that are currently being used, misused, and abused by terrorist groups and by criminal organizations. And if governments are unwilling to create legislation and ensure that content is taken down, and even go to the extent of investigating and prosecuting the executives of those tech companies, we will lose in the fight, we will fail in the fight. So we have to regulate the virtual space, because if you look at the physical threats and the digital threats are 90%. So the digital environment has to be controlled. And this is a classic case of how the digital environment has shaped the current physical environment. Let me very quickly share with you that the investigation continues. But today, the single biggest threat in this region is that extremist ideologies are entering this region of Southeast Asia, both from the West, that is the right-wing ideologies, and also from the Middle East, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Xinjiang. So key is control and enforcement. If we don't do the enforcement and control in the digital space, there will be a steep rise of extremism, and extremism leads to terrorism. Many of my colleagues in the West are willing to take action against violent acts of terrorism, but they are reluctant to take action against ideological extremism. But it is time today to take action. My British colleague spoke of the British initiatives, but Britain failed to maintain the standards from which we have learned. It is because of unregulated migration, spread of those extremist ideologies, and the failure to integrate those migrant communities who live in ghettos. They are not British. So what is important today is to manage those threats very effectively to prevent the spread of these ideologies. 90% of these ideologies are from the Middle East. But right-wing extremism is on the rise, and that will become a very dominant threat in the coming years, as we have seen. So we have to act against a spectrum of ideologies. In this case, the 17-year-old was influenced what you call by salad bar ideologies, several ideologies, but exacerbated by his personal grievances, the challenges at his home front and his school front. So my advice to parents is keep the children close to you so that we can reduce the risks of their radicalization and shift towards violence. Let's look at the Asia Pacific region very quickly. Terrorism is the biggest national security threat, terrorism and organized crime. But I want to share with you that the threat has very significantly increased in 2024. In 2023, there was the second worst terrorist attack the world has witnessed. That is the Hamas attack in Israel. Many people are reluctant to call it a terrorist attack. But I can tell you by examining that attack very closely and very deeply, it is an act of terrorism. So after 9/11, the second worst attack was the Hamas attack, where 251 people were taken hostage and more than 1,200 people were killed. Do not have sympathies towards any group that perpetrate terrorism, although their cause may be legitimate. We have to hunt them relentlessly, decimate their organizations, and decapitate their leadership. That is what exactly Israel is doing. And if we do not dismantle groups like the Lebanese Hezbollah or the Ansarullah in Yemen, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, these groups, the threat of global terrorism will rise. Let me also share with you that the terrorism was highest in 2015 because of the rise of ISIS. And today we have seen the rise of a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. And Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So if you look at the threats of terrorism, the threat landscape hasn't fundamentally changed. Middle East is the epicenter of terrorism. But from this epicenter, we have seen that the threat has moved in two directions. It has moved towards Asia, where Pakistan and Afghanistan has become the main centers in Asia. But this threat is percolating, is moving. It is cascading towards Central Asia, towards South Asia, towards Southeast Asia, towards Northeast Asia, and even to Oceania, notably Australia and New Zealand. The second vector is it's moving towards Africa. Africa will be the next epicenter of terrorism. So Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, these countries are very severely affected by ISIS, by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Every day there are killings, and there are kidnappings, and there is extortion, there is spread of extremist ideologies. Let me also give you a very quick snapshot of how the threat has moved. It peaked in 2014 with the rise of ISIS or the Islamic State. It has declined somewhat, but it again peaked with the Hamas attack in the Middle East. So this is by country the threat we have seen: Burkina Faso, Pakistan, Niger, Syria, Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, and of course the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon, Russia. Russia, because we have seen that ISIS variant called ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan province, has become very active. Its leader is very young, 31 years old, a man called Al-Muhajir, or known as Sanaullah Ghaffari. He has perfected the art of using Telegram to reach out to distant theaters, radicalize, recruit, and conduct attacks. So Pakistan is the main base of ISKP. So the Islamic State that was in Syria, today it has built its most potent outfit on the Afghan-Pakistan border. Pakistan and Afghanis are fighting with each other because the threat groups are moving back and forth. So this will remain a key operating environment. In the past, my American and European friends were very worried about Middle Easterners coming to their countries. Today, the threat is largely from the Afghan-Pakistan theater, in addition to those who are coming from the Middle East. But in the future, it will be from Africa, because we are seeing the movement of those ideologies, development of operational capabilities of groups, networks, and cells. Let me also share with you, in terms of region, MENA, that is Middle East, North Africa, is the highest. Second is South Asia, then Africa, the Asia Pacific region. So the threat is shifting to this region in a very significant way. That is why I think that ASIS and also the ASIS Foundation can play a pivotal role to prevent and preempt attacks. Increase your partnership, build capabilities, especially in the poorer countries. Still, the knowledge for fighting terrorism is largely in the Western nations. It's with the Americans, with the Brits, with the continental Europeans, with the Australians, New Zealanders. But unless we share that partnership, we are going to fail in the fight. Africa, Middle East, and the poorer regions of Asia still don't have those capabilities, and we still have much to learn from our Western partners that have the discipline, the knowledge, and the staying power. Let me also share with you the deaths of terrorism continue. It has persisted, and total deaths have decreased after ISIS was dismantled in the banks of the Euphrates. But ISIS is re-emerging in the Pakistan-Afghanistan vector, and it is having a very significant impact beyond the AFPAC region because of its capacity to harness technology and mount attacks. So the total deaths worldwide, it peaked in 2014, 2015, it decreased, but 2023 it rose again because of the Hamas attack. These are the key main groups that are mounting the attacks. So most of the terrorist deaths are because of the ideologies of these groups. There are other groups, but these groups kill the largest number of people around the world. This is the attack in 2023. It is correct that the Palestinians have suffered many injustices, and it is so important to create a two-state solution. But at the same time, no country, no organization should support or sympathize with terrorism. It is a terrible mistake to do that. Many of the demonstrations we have seen globally for the Palestinian cause are not infiltrated by Hamas. But most recently, we have seen very significant penetration of Hamas ideologies to those demonstrations. That is why it is so important to regulate those demonstrations so that those demonstrations will not impact on the Muslim communities. If that happens, those extremist ideologies from Hamas will penetrate and influence those communities, and they will become as radical as those groups that stage those attacks. So governments have to have a very sophisticated approach of addressing the legitimate political grievances, but not permitting terrorism or the extremism that drives terrorism. What do I mean by extremism? That is the hate, the resentment, the prejudice, the suspicion that ultimately becomes the main foundation for extremist ideologies and terrorism. Here you can see again how the threat rose in the Middle East, and unfortunately we have seen number of Middle Eastern countries, government sponsoring these groups. This sponsorship should end. If it doesn't end, those countries should come under the surveillance of nations, and we have to disrupt that funding and that support. For example, Iran is a key supporter of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, of Ansarullah in Yemen, of Lebanese Hezbollah, and Hashtasabi in Iraq, and a number of terrorist groups also in this region. Iran recently sponsored a major terrorist attack in Australia. Australian government decided to shut down the Israeli embassy, shut down the embassy of Iran, work with the Israelis to disrupt further plots. IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, already attacked 2 targets in Australia. So IRGC continues to mount operations not only in Australia, but in other countries. For example, there was an attempt against Trump before he became president by IRGC. A man called Farhad Shakiri was recruited by the Iranian intelligence service to kill Trump. Iranian assessment was that Trump will not win the elections and that it would be easier to kill him after the elections when he is no longer president. But of course, Trump became president and he cooperated with Israel to mount attacks against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. So you can see how the security and intelligence services are today working with criminal entities and with terrorist groups. We have seen in Europe, number of criminal groups have been recruited by hostile states to conduct attacks. So terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't only come from non-state actors. So it also comes from state actors. Let me make a few concluding remarks. The threat of terrorism has in many ways affected the global north, that is North America, Canada, US, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. But terrorism is largely a phenomenon of the Middle East, Asia, and increasingly Africa. So there must be very good security and intelligence cooperation to fight that. The new threat that is emerging is from the far right. Let me just conclude my presentation by sharing with you that lone actor threat is a very significant threat. It is currently the dominant threat in Singapore. Why do I say that? Most of the people arrested after 2001 in Singapore has been lone actors, self-radicalized individuals. So I conclude my presentation by asking all of you to continue the good work that you're doing, but move from counter-terrorism cooperation to collaboration, from collaboration to partnership. What do I mean by cooperation to collaboration and partnership? 5 things. One is common databases. ASIS build very effective database that you will share with government and the private sector. Crime Stoppers International, we are doing the same because I serve on its Specialist Advisory Council. Second, exchange personnel, law enforcement, military intelligence. Third, do joint training. This is a good example of a joint training. Joint training will lead to joint operations. And finally, share experience and expertise, technology and resources. I thank you very much. All the best, ladies and gentlemen.